The first sign that something was wrong was not that I was missing from the guest list. It was that nobody seemed willing to answer a simple question. My name is Thomas Bennett. I am 72 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard enough and sacrificed enough for your children, one day you would get to stand back and watch them succeed. That belief carried me through long nights, difficult business decisions, and more financial risks than I care to remember. It was also the reason I invested $900,000 into my son Ryan's dream of opening his own medical clinic. I did not see it as a transaction. I saw it as a father helping his son build something meaningful. Ryan had always been ambitious. Even as a boy, he talked about helping people. While other kids changed career plans every few months, Ryan stayed focused. He wanted to become a doctor. Years later, he did exactly that. I was proud of him every step of the way. When the opportunity came to open his own clinic, I believed in him completely. I sold investments, delayed retirement plans, moved money I had spent decades building. Every decision felt worthwhile because I was investing in family. A few weeks before the clinic's grand opening, I called Ryan one evening. The conversation started normally enough. We talked about the weather, a baseball game he had watched, and how busy he had been preparing for the launch. Then I asked a simple question. So when exactly is the grand opening? There was a pause. Not a long pause, just long enough for me to notice. We are still finalizing a few things, Ryan replied. Nothing is completely set yet. His answer surprised me. The opening had been discussed for months. Advertising had already started. Construction had finished weeks earlier. Well, let me know, I said. I would not miss it for the world. Another pause followed. Then he changed the subject. At the time, I told myself he was simply stressed. Opening a medical practice is complicated. There are permits, inspections, staffing issues, equipment deliveries, and countless details. Still, something about that conversation stayed with me. A few days later, I called again. This time, Ryan did not answer. He sent a text several hours later saying he was busy and would call back soon. He never did. The following week, I spoke with my daughter-in-law, Lauren. She managed many of the business operations for the clinic. Everything must be exciting right now, I said. I imagine the opening is right around the corner. Oh, definitely, she replied cheerfully. We are working hard. Have invitations gone out yet? I asked. For a brief moment, her voice changed. There are still details being handled. Then she quickly moved the conversation elsewhere. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every time I mentioned the grand opening, people became uncomfortable. Every answer felt incomplete. Every conversation ended before I learned anything useful. One afternoon, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, I opened my laptop and searched for the clinic online. I expected to find opening dates, announcements, and promotional material. Instead, I found something that left me staring at the screen much longer than I intended. The clinic was everywhere. Professional photographs, interviews, social media campaigns, community outreach announcements. Yet as I clicked through page after page, one question continued to grow louder in my mind. If everyone seemed eager to talk about the clinic, why did nobody want to talk about it with me? At first, I assumed I was imagining things. Age has a way of making people question their instincts. You tell yourself you are being overly sensitive. You convince yourself there must be a reasonable explanation. That was exactly what I did. I spent the next hour browsing through the clinic's website. The design was impressive. Professional photographs showed bright examination rooms, advanced equipment, smiling staff members, and community outreach events. Ryan appeared in nearly every section. Lauren appeared frequently as well. There were articles about the clinic's mission, interviews discussing its future, and even a timeline describing how the business had been built from an idea into reality. I read every word carefully. Then I read it again. Something was missing. Or rather, someone was missing. My name never appeared once. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. That alone should not have bothered me. I had never invested money expecting public recognition. I did not need a plaque on the wall or my name printed in brochures. Still, the omission felt strange. $900,000 is not a small contribution. It represented decades of work, planning, and sacrifice. Most people would at least acknowledge where that support came from. The following morning, I decided to visit the clinic in person. Construction had officially finished, and according to the website, staff training was underway before the public opening. The building itself was beautiful. Modern architecture, Large glass windows. Fresh landscaping. Patients driving past would immediately trust the place. As I stood across the street looking at it, I felt a familiar sense of pride. For a moment, all my concerns faded. My son had accomplished something remarkable. Then I noticed a large banner hanging near the entrance. It displayed photographs of Ryan and Lauren beneath the words founders and visionaries. I stood there longer than I cared to admit. The phrase echoed in my mind. Founders and visionaries. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table 5 years earlier when Ryan first presented the business plan. I remembered helping him calculate costs. I remembered writing checks when banks refused financing. I remembered reassuring him during setbacks. Yet standing there, reading those words, I felt strangely disconnected from the story being told. Before leaving, I walked into a nearby coffee shop. Several clinic employees occupied a large table near the window. They were discussing preparations for the opening celebration. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but certain phrases naturally drifted across the room. The guest list is almost finalized. Media coverage is confirmed. The city council representative will be there. Ryan is excited about the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I listened quietly while stirring my coffee. Not once did I hear anyone mention family. Not once did I hear anyone mention investors. Most surprising of all, nobody mentioned me. That afternoon, I called Ryan again. This time, he answered immediately. His voice sounded rushed. "Hey, Dad. Everything okay?" I smiled despite the growing uneasiness in my chest. "Everything is fine. I was just wondering if you finalized the date yet." Another silence followed. "We are still working through some details." I glanced at the clinic website still open on my laptop. The opening date was displayed prominently on the front page. "Really?" I asked gently, because the website seems pretty confident. The silence became longer this time. Much longer. Finally, Ryan laughed awkwardly. "You know how marketing teams are. Sometimes they publish things before everything is finalized." We spoke for another minute before ending the call. Afterward, I sat quietly in my living room staring at my phone. Ryan had never been a good liar. Even as a child, I could always hear it in his voice. For the first time since this started, a difficult possibility entered my mind. What if the problem was not that nobody had remembered to invite me? What if they had made a deliberate decision not to? For the next several days, I tried to convince myself that I was wrong. No father wants to believe his own son would deliberately keep him at a distance. I found reasons to explain everything. Ryan was busy. Lauren was overwhelmed. The clinic launch was creating stress. Yet the uncomfortable feeling refused to disappear. Then, 3 days later, the answer arrived in the most ordinary way possible. I was having lunch with an old business acquaintance named Frank. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. During our conversation, he casually mentioned seeing advertisements for Ryan's clinic all over town. I smiled politely and told him the opening was coming soon. Frank nodded. "I actually received an invitation last week. Looks like it will be a big event." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "An invitation?" I asked. "Sure," he replied. "Very professional. Ribbon-cutting ceremony. Media coverage. Local officials. The whole thing." He continued speaking, but I barely heard the rest. My attention fixed on a single fact. Invitations had already been distributed. Not planned. Not pending. Distributed. After lunch, I sat alone in my car for nearly 20 minutes. I stared through the windshield at people walking past without really seeing them. The opening date was finalized. The guest list was finalized. The event was happening. And somehow, everyone seemed to know except me. That evening, I returned home and opened my email. I searched every folder. Inbox. Spam. Archived messages. Promotions. Nothing. No invitation. No announcement. No information. The next morning, I called Ryan again. This time, I decided to be direct. "I had lunch with Frank yesterday," I said. Silence. He mentioned receiving an invitation. Another silence followed. Longer than before. "Dad, things have been complicated," Ryan finally said. "Complicated how?" I asked calmly. "There are limited seats. We had to make difficult decisions." I almost laughed. The explanation was so absurd that I did not know how to respond. Limited seats. I had invested $900,000. I had spent years supporting the project. Yet apparently there was not enough room for me. "I understand," I said quietly. "Do you?" Ryan sounded relieved. "Yes," I replied. "I understand more than you think." After ending the call, I sat in my living room and looked around the house. Family photographs covered the walls. Ryan at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Ryan graduating from medical school. Ryan standing beside me at a fishing lake when he was young. Every picture represented a memory. Every memory represented trust. I began wondering when that trust had started to disappear. Later that afternoon, curiosity led me back to the clinic website. This time, I paid attention to details I had previously ignored. There was an entire section dedicated to the clinic's story. It described Ryan's vision, Lauren's leadership, their journey, their sacrifices, their determination. The narrative was carefully written and professionally presented. Yet one thing stood out immediately. According to the official story, the clinic seemed to have appeared almost entirely through their efforts alone. No mention of early financial support. No mention of outside investment. No mention of the years when Ryan called me worried about funding. No mention of the checks I wrote when traditional financing fell apart. It was as though a chapter had been removed from a book. The story still functioned, but it was no longer complete. As evening approached, I closed the laptop and sat quietly by the window. The sun was setting beyond the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Normally, moments like that brought peace. Not this time, because for the first time, I was no longer asking whether I had been forgotten. I was beginning to suspect that someone had been rewriting history. And if that was true, then the grand opening was only the beginning of a much larger story. The grand opening took place on a bright Saturday morning. I knew that because the clinic's social media pages had been counting down to the event for days. Nobody had invited me. Nobody had sent an email. Nobody had called. Yet after everything I had learned, staying home no longer felt like the right choice. I put on a navy blazer, polished my shoes, and drove across town. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Local business owners mingled near the sidewalk. A television crew was setting up equipment beside a temporary stage. Everything looked polished and successful. For a brief moment, I felt proud again. Then I reminded myself why I was there. I walked toward the registration table positioned near the front entrance. Two young employees greeted guests with practiced smiles. One of them asked for my name. Thomas Bennett, I replied. She scanned a list on her tablet. Then she frowned slightly. She checked again. I am sorry, sir. Could you repeat that? I did. She searched a second time. The smile on her face became uncomfortable. I do not see your name on the guest list. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I was surprised. By then, I already suspected something was wrong. But hearing it spoken aloud felt different. Real. Final. Before I could respond, another employee approached. It is okay, he said. There is still standing room available inside. Standing room. I thanked them politely and walked through the entrance. The lobby buzzed with excitement. Fresh flowers decorated every surface. Large banners displayed photographs of Ryan and Lauren. Several screens played promotional videos highlighting the clinic's journey. Patients, community leaders, and local reporters filled the room. As I moved through the crowd, I listened carefully. Conversations repeated the same story. Ryan's vision, Ryan's determination, Lauren's leadership, Ryan and Lauren building everything from the ground up. The narrative was consistent. So consistent that it felt rehearsed. Then the ribbon-cutting ceremony began. Guests gathered around the stage. Ryan stepped forward to applause. Lauren stood beside him smiling confidently. The master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and began introducing key contributors. Architects, contractors, marketing consultants, financial partners, community sponsors. One by one, people received recognition. One by one, they were thanked publicly. I stood near the back of the crowd listening. My name never came. When Ryan began speaking, the applause grew louder. He talked about hard work, sacrifice, believing in a dream, building something that would serve the community for generations. Much of what he said was true, yet every sentence felt incomplete. The story sounded polished, but pieces were missing. Important pieces. At one point, a reporter standing nearby turned toward another guest and asked how Ryan had funded such an ambitious project. The guest shrugged. I heard he secured financing through smart business planning. I looked away, not because I was angry, because I suddenly understood something. Most people there were not trying to ignore the truth. They simply did not know it. They were repeating the version of events they had been given. After the ceremony ended, people lined up to congratulate Ryan. I waited until the crowd thinned. When he finally saw me, surprise flashed across his face. Not happiness, not excitement. Surprise. "Dad," he said quietly, "what are you doing here?" I looked around at the smiling guests, the cameras, the banners, and the celebration I had helped make possible. Then I met my son's eyes. I came to see what $900,000 looks like when it forgets who paid for it. Ryan stared at me for several seconds without speaking. Around us, guests continued laughing, shaking hands, and taking photographs. The celebration moved forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet the expression on my son's face told a different story. He knew exactly what I meant. "Dad, this is not the place," he said quietly. "Then when is the place?" I asked. Because every time I ask a question, nobody seems willing to answer it. Ryan glanced around nervously. A reporter was standing less than 20 feet away. Several employees were nearby. Lauren appeared at his side almost immediately, as though she had been watching the conversation unfold. "Thomas, we can discuss this later," she said with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. I nodded. That seems to be everyone's favorite phrase lately. Neither of them responded. For a few moments we stood there in uncomfortable silence. Then Ryan excused himself and returned to greeting guests. I watched him walk away before quietly leaving the event. The drive home felt much longer than usual. Not because of traffic, because memories kept surfacing. Memories I had spent years viewing through the lens of pride. Now I was beginning to see them differently. 5 years earlier, Ryan had arrived at my house carrying a thick binder filled with financial projections. He had been excited, nervous, hopeful. He explained his vision for the clinic in extraordinary detail. Every room, every service, every future expansion. The total cost exceeded anything he could secure through traditional financing. Banks viewed the project as risky. Investors wanted controlling interests. Ryan did not want strangers dictating medical decisions. That night we sat at my dining room table until nearly midnight. I still remember the look on his face when he finally asked for help. He hated asking. Pride runs deep in our family. I listened carefully, reviewed every page, and then told him something I believed with all my heart. "If you are willing to work this hard for your dream, I am willing to stand beside you." Over the next several years, the support continued. The first investment covered property acquisition. The second helped during construction delays. Later came equipment purchases, staffing shortages, unexpected regulatory expenses, and rising costs that seemed to appear every few months. Every time Ryan called worried, I found a way to help. Not because he demanded it, because I wanted him to succeed. Looking back, what hurt most was not the money. Money can be earned again. The painful part was realizing how completely I had trusted him. That evening, I opened a storage cabinet in my home office. Inside were dozens of folders documenting the clinic's history, original proposals, loan agreements, investment records, email correspondence, meeting notes. For years, I had rarely looked at them. There was no reason to. I trusted family. As I sorted through the files, one detail caught my attention. Several documents referenced ownership percentages, voting rights, and financial protections that I had almost forgotten existed. At the time, they seemed like routine legal formalities. Now they looked different. Much different. I spent hours reading. The deeper I looked, the more questions emerged. Certain provisions appeared far more significant than Ryan had ever acknowledged. Long after midnight, I remained seated at my desk surrounded by paperwork. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Inside, my understanding of the situation was beginning to change. Until then, I had viewed myself as an excluded father, a forgotten investor, a man pushed to the margins of a story he helped create. But as I reviewed those documents, another possibility emerged. Perhaps I was not nearly as powerless as Ryan and Lauren believed. And if that was true, then the grand opening was not the end of the story. It was only the moment when I finally started paying attention. 2 days after the grand opening, my phone rang while I was reviewing documents in my home office. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored calls from numbers I did not recognize, but something made me answer. "Mr. Bennett?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." There was a brief hesitation. "My name is Melissa. I work at the clinic." I leaned back in my chair. "How can I help you?" Another pause followed. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "Careful. I am not calling because I need help. I am calling because I think you deserve to know something." Instantly, my attention sharpened. For the next several minutes, Melissa spoke cautiously, choosing her words with obvious care. She explained that she had joined the clinic during its early development stages and had attended many planning meetings. At first, nothing she said surprised me. Then the conversation took a different turn. Your name used to be included in everything, she said. Presentations, funding discussions, staff introductions. Everyone knew you were the primary investor. My grip tightened around the phone. Used to be? I asked. Yes. Silence filled the line. What changed? Another pause. I do not know exactly when it started, but about a year ago, references to you began disappearing. I said nothing. At first it was small things. A slide removed from a presentation, then a brochure redesign, then website revisions. Eventually, new employees stopped hearing your name entirely. After ending the call, I sat motionless for several minutes. Melissa had confirmed something I had only suspected. This was not forgetfulness. It was not oversight. It was a process, a deliberate one. Later that afternoon, I drove to a public park and spent several hours walking. I needed space to think. The more I replayed the conversation, the more one question bothered me. Why? Why erase me from the story? I had never demanded recognition. I had never interfered with daily operations. I had never attempted to control Ryan's decisions. In fact, I had gone out of my way to stay in the background. Yet somehow that had not been enough. The following morning, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. While reviewing old email archives, I discovered a chain of messages from nearly 18 months earlier. Most involved marketing consultants discussing branding strategy. One message included notes from a planning meeting. Buried among ordinary recommendations was a sentence that stopped me cold. The clinic's public identity should emphasize independent leadership and avoid associations that create perceptions of outside control. I read the line 3 times. Then 4. Independent leadership. Outside control. The language sounded professional, but the meaning was becoming clear. Somewhere along the way, my investment had stopped being viewed as support and started being viewed as an inconvenience. That evening, I met Frank for dinner. As we talked, he noticed my distracted expression. Something is bothering you, he said. I smiled faintly. You could say that. After listening to the situation, Frank remained quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. Have you looked closely at your governance rights? I frowned. Governance rights? Voting authority. Oversight provisions. Approval requirements. The protections built into the investment structure. I remembered seeing those terms in the documents stacked on my desk. At the time, they seemed routine. Now they sounded important. Very important. When I returned home, I immediately began reviewing the files again. This time, I focused on sections I had previously skimmed. Legal language filled page after page. Most of it was tedious. Then I found a clause that made me stop reading. Slowly, I sat back in my chair. For years, I had assumed my role ended with providing capital. According to the agreement in front of me, that assumption was completely wrong. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I understood why someone might have wanted me forgotten. I spent the entire weekend reviewing documents. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted control. I simply wanted the truth. The clause I had discovered continued to occupy my thoughts. Years earlier, when the investment agreement was drafted, my attorney insisted on including several protections. At the time, Ryan resisted some of them. He wanted flexibility. I wanted security. Eventually, we reached a compromise. I signed the documents and rarely thought about them again. Now, sitting alone in my office, I realized how significant those protections actually were. The agreement granted me voting authority over certain major decisions affecting ownership structure, governance changes, and significant financial transactions. More importantly, those rights remained active. They had never been revoked. They had never been transferred. They had never expired. For years, nobody mentioned them because nobody needed to. The clinic was growing. Everyone appeared happy. There was no conflict. But now the silence surrounding those rights seemed intentional. Monday morning, I contacted the attorney who had originally helped draft the documents. His name was Charles Reynolds. We had worked together for decades. After reviewing the paperwork, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses. Thomas, do you realize what this means? He asked. I am beginning to. Charles nodded slowly. Your position is much stronger than you think. I listened carefully as he explained the legal framework in plain English. The investment had never been structured as a gift. It was a protected capital contribution tied to governance provisions. Those provisions existed precisely to prevent major stakeholders from being erased or marginalized. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my car with a completely different perspective. For weeks I had focused on what had been taken away: recognition, respect, inclusion. Now I was beginning to understand what remained. That afternoon, another surprise arrived. Melissa called again. Her voice sounded nervous. "I thought you should know something," she said. "There is a board meeting next week." I frowned. "The clinic has a board?" "A small governance committee," she replied. "Ryan, Lauren, 2 outside advisors." I waited. And another pause followed. "There is discussion about restructuring future ownership interests." My stomach tightened. "What kind of restructuring?" "I do not know every detail, but I heard your name mentioned." After the call ended, several pieces suddenly connected. The marketing changes, the disappearing references, the revised narrative. The timing was too convenient to ignore. If governance restructuring was approaching, removing me from public perception beforehand would make the transition appear natural. New employees would not ask questions. Community leaders would not ask questions. Future investors would not ask questions. The story would already be established. Ryan and Lauren as the sole architects of success. Everyone else forgotten. That evening, I received an email notification from the clinic. It was the first official communication I had received in months. The subject line referenced routine governance matters. Attached was a notice regarding the upcoming meeting. I opened the document slowly. There it was. My name. Not omitted. Not forgotten. Not removed. Included because it had to be. Included because the legal structure required it. For several minutes, I stared at the screen. Then I smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because I had won anything. Not because someone was about to lose. But because the truth was finally emerging from the shadows. The version of history being presented to the public and the reality documented in legal agreements were not the same. And next week, for the first time since the grand opening, everyone would be sitting in the same room with both versions present. I had no intention of creating a scene. No intention of embarrassing my son. But I was finished pretending that none of this mattered. Someone had spent years trying to remove me from the story. What they had forgotten was that some signatures remain powerful long after the ink has dried. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in a conference room on the second floor of the clinic. I arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist looked surprised when she saw me, but she remained professional and directed me upstairs. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Ryan reviewing documents while Lauren spoke quietly with one of the outside advisors. Neither of them noticed me at first. I stood there for a moment, looking at the business they had worked so hard to build. Despite everything that had happened, I still felt proud of what Ryan had accomplished. That was the strange part. Betrayal and pride can exist side by side. When I entered the room, the conversation stopped. Ryan looked up immediately. His expression revealed more concern than surprise. Lauren sat straighter in her chair. The 2 outside advisors exchanged brief glances before offering polite greetings. I took my seat without saying much. The meeting began with routine reports. Financial performance. Patient growth. Expansion opportunities. The clinic was doing exceptionally well. Revenue exceeded projections. Community response remained strong. Every report confirmed what I had already suspected. The business was thriving. Eventually, the discussion moved toward governance matters. A packet of documents was distributed around the table. I flipped through the pages slowly. Several proposed changes focused on future ownership structures and authority allocations. The language was technical, but the intention was clear. The clinic wanted to simplify decision-making by concentrating authority among active operators. On the surface, the proposal sounded reasonable. But I noticed something important. The proposal would significantly reduce the practical influence of existing stakeholders who were not involved in daily operations. Stakeholders like me. One of the advisors began explaining the recommendation. Ryan listened quietly. Lauren nodded along. When the presentation ended, the room fell silent. Finally, the advisor looked toward me. "Mr. Bennett, do you have any questions?" I closed the packet and folded my hands together. Just one. Everyone waited. Why was I excluded from the grand opening? The question landed harder than any legal argument could have. Nobody expected it. The advisors looked confused. Ryan lowered his eyes. Lauren's expression tightened. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ryan finally exhaled. "Dad." I raised a hand gently. not to silence him, to slow the moment down. I am not asking as an investor, I said calmly. I am asking as your father. The room became very still. Ryan stared at the table. The confident physician who addressed large audiences suddenly looked like the young man who once sat across from me asking for help. I did not know how to handle it, he admitted quietly. Handle what? I asked. He swallowed hard. People kept talking about the investment. Reporters asked questions. Business partners asked questions. Some people assumed the clinic only existed because of your money. I listened carefully. And that bothered you? His answer came slowly. At first, yes. Lauren looked down. Ryan continued. I wanted people to see what I had built. I wanted them to recognize my work. Somewhere along the way, I started treating your support like something that competed with my success instead of making it possible. Nobody interrupted him, not even Lauren. Then it became easier to leave things out than explain them, he said. And after a while, I convinced myself it was not a big deal. The honesty in his voice changed the entire atmosphere of the room. This was no longer about contracts or governance. It was about something much simpler. Pride, fear, gratitude left unspoken. I looked around the table. The advisors remained silent. Lauren's eyes were fixed on the documents in front of her. Finally, I spoke. Ryan, I never wanted credit for your achievements. He looked up. I know that now. For the first time in weeks, I believed him. And in that moment, before a single vote had been cast or a single document signed, the balance of power in the room had already begun to shift. The meeting ended differently than anyone expected. No votes were taken that day. No restructuring proposals moved forward. The advisors suggested postponing all governance changes until everyone had an opportunity to review the situation more carefully. For the first time in a long while, nobody seemed interested in rushing. As people gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Ryan remained seated. Lauren stayed beside him. The confidence that had surrounded both of them for months appeared replaced by something far more honest. Reflection. A week later, Ryan asked if we could have dinner together. Just the two of us. We met at a small restaurant overlooking a lake on the edge of town. Years earlier, we used to visit the same place after fishing trips. Sitting across from him that evening felt strangely familiar. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. The food, the weather, the clinic. Then Ryan placed his fork down and looked directly at me. I owe you an apology. The words were simple. There was no speech prepared in advance. No attempt to defend what had happened. Just honesty. I spent so much time trying to prove I could succeed on my own that I started treating your support like something I needed to hide. I listened quietly. The truth is that none of this would exist without you. He shook his head slowly. And somewhere along the way, I stopped saying that out loud. For the first time since the grand opening, I felt the weight I had been carrying begin to lift. Not because Ryan was admitting mistakes, because he was finally telling the truth. A few days later, the clinic released a new community newsletter. I almost ignored it when it arrived in my inbox. Then I noticed something unusual. There was an article discussing the clinic's history. This time, the story was different. It spoke about the challenges of launching a medical practice. It mentioned the people who helped make the project possible. Employees, advisors, community supporters. And there, near the center of the article, was a photograph of Ryan and me standing together during the early construction phase. The caption described my role accurately. No exaggeration, no special praise, just the truth. Later that week, Ryan invited me back to the clinic. As we walked through the hallways, employees greeted me warmly. Several introduced themselves for the first time. Others thanked me for helping create a place that served so many families. The recognition felt nice, but it was not what mattered most. What mattered was watching Ryan move through the building without trying to separate himself from the people who helped him succeed. The insecurity that had driven so many bad decisions seemed to be fading. Before leaving, we stopped near the entrance where visitors first entered the clinic. A new display had been installed beside the reception area. It highlighted the clinic's founding story and the individuals who contributed to its creation. Ryan noticed me looking at it and smiled. "This feels more accurate," he said. I nodded. "Yes, it does." Months later, the clinic continued to thrive. Patient numbers increased. Expansion plans moved forward. Life settled into a healthier rhythm. More importantly, our relationship improved. We spoke regularly, not about investments or governance, about family, about life, about the things that should have mattered all along. Looking back now, I realized the greatest mistake was never the missing invitation. It was allowing silence to grow where gratitude should have lived. Silence has a way of rewriting stories if nobody challenges it. Fortunately, the truth has a way of returning. Sometimes quietly, sometimes slowly, but eventually it returns. I invested $900,000 into my son's dream. In the end, the most valuable return was not financial. It was watching my son remember who helped him build it and having the courage to say so. And that was worth far more than any seat at a grand opening ever could be.